It all started with a knock at the door. For most people, a visit from the FBI would be a terrifying moment, one that could change everything in the blink of an eye. For Thomas Raines, it wasn't just a shock, it was the unraveling of his entire life. A quiet, methodical man with no prior record and a job in cybersecurity. Thomas had no idea why federal agents were suddenly surrounding his home. But what they told him left him speechless. He was a prime suspect in a nationwide cybercrime investigation. The words hit him like a thunderclap. Everything he'd worked for, his reputation, his freedom, was all under threat. But Thomas wasn't just going to sit back and take the fall. What he did next would not only clear his name, would expose a criminal far more dangerous than anyone imagined. The FBI had been chasing a digital ghost, someone who had breached multiple corporate networks, stolen sensitive data, and left behind an almost invisible trail. All signs, according to their analysts, pointed to Thomas. He matched the hackers' digital footprint. His login credentials had been used. His online behavior aligned with the crime's timeline. For the agents, it seemed airtight, catchy, but there was one problem. Thomas knew he was innocent. And not just in the abstract sense, he knew deep in his core that he hadn't done this. But proving that was another matter entirely. Every explanation he gave was met with skepticism. Every protest of innocence felt like shouting into the void. Yet Thomas wasn't the type to give up. He began piecing things together on his own, hoping to find the crack in the story the FBI had built around him. Thomas went back to the beginning. If someone had framed him, they had to be close either physically or digitally. He started examining his own logs, his server access records, and surveillance from the days in question. That's when something strange stood out: a login to one of his personal servers, time-stamped at a moment he could prove he was nowhere near a computer. Stranger still, the IP address tied to that login came from a coworker's old laptop, one Thomas had repaired months earlier. Could someone he trusted have used that connection to set him up? As he dug deeper, he uncovered more anomalies: login attempts at odd hours, hidden scripts buried deep in his file directories, and spoofed metadata pointing to someone inside his own circle. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't just a mistake by law enforcement. It was a setup, and it was personal. Armed with his findings, Thomas requested a second meeting with the FBI. He knew he had only one shot to make them listen. And the stakes couldn't be higher. At first, the agents were dismissive, confident in their data, firm in their beliefs. But as Thomas began walking them through his evidence point by point, timestamp by timestamp, their expressions shifted. He showed how the supposed login could not have been him, how the metadata had been manipulated, and how the IP address traced back to someone else entirely. One name kept popping up during the analysis: Daniel Harper, a fellow tech expert at Thomas's firm, and someone he once considered a friend. The FBI agents leaned in. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity anymore. It was starting to look like a betrayal from within. Now the tables were turning. With Thomas no longer the prime suspect, the FBI began shifting their focus. Quietly, they launched a separate investigation into Daniel Harper. What they uncovered was disturbing: encrypted communications with known cybercriminal forums, hidden Bitcoin transactions, and evidence that Daniel had been using Thomas's credentials to mask his activities for over 6 months. The facade of the model employee crumbled quickly. Thomas, once labeled the criminal, was now the key to unraveling a much bigger scheme. But this was only the beginning. The deeper they looked, the more they found on Thomas's nightmare was far from over. The man who had exposed the real criminal was now part of something much larger, something darker, and it would take everything he had to survive what came next. As the FBI turned their attention to Daniel Harper, the depth of the betrayal began to come into focus. Thomas had known Daniel for years. They had worked side by side on dozens of cybersecurity projects. To think that the person who had once shared lunch breaks and late-night deadlines was capable of something so insidious it was difficult to process. But the data didn't lie. As investigators probed deeper into Daniel's activity, they discovered a pattern of internal breaches masked behind Thomas's credentials. Daniel had gained access to sensitive systems by exploiting trust, exploiting routine, and exploiting Thomas himself. What began as minor data siphoning quickly escalated into coordinated hacks on financial institutions and high-value tech firms. The FBI, initially convinced they had found their man in Thomas, now realized they'd been chasing the wrong shadow. Thomas, while no longer a suspect, wasn't free to walk away. He had inadvertently become a key player in the unraveling of a cybercriminal operation with international ties. The agents asked him to assist not as a suspect or a bystander, but as an inside expert. And so, he found himself drawn into the very world he had spent his career trying to protect others from, working alongside federal cybersecurity specialists. Thomas began to map out Daniel's tactics. They traced spoofed server requests, examined code obfuscation techniques, and followed trails of cryptocurrency transactions that vanished into the dark web. Each thread Thomas pulled seemed to lead to another layer of deception. Daniel hadn't just framed him, he had built an entire digital identity over Thomas's footprints, effectively living a second life online in his name. What shocked everyone most was how long Daniel had been planning it. Backup files from Thomas's work laptop, something he hadn't accessed in nearly a year, had been tampered with long before the FBI ever knocked on his door. There were text files, logs, and even voice notes made to sound like Thomas, using AI-generated audio. Daniel had been methodical. He knew how the system worked, and he knew how to break it. And the deeper they went, the clearer it became. This was no amateur operation. Someone had backed Daniel, the technology used, the precision. The funding all pointed to a larger network. The FBI began considering whether Daniel was part of a cybercrime syndicate. And if so, Thomas's nightmare was far from over. The next phase of the investigation brought a chilling revelation. As Thomas continued collaborating with federal agents, a new set of encrypted files was discovered on one of Daniel's cloud backups. These files contained not just logs of prior cyber attacks, but blueprints for future ones, plans targeting critical infrastructure, energy grids, and even election systems. This was no longer a story about personal betrayal or corporate espionage. This was national security, and Thomas had a front row seat. The FBI elevated the case from cybercrime to potential terrorism, and the tone in the room changed. Everyone was now operating under heightened urgency. Thomas was relocated to a secure facility, and every conversation, every file, and every insight he shared was now classified. Despite the growing seriousness of the case, Thomas remained focused. He knew that Daniel's behavior wasn't entirely his own. There were signs in the code that pointed to external influence, bits of digital accent from foreign scripting languages, command sequences that mirrored known techniques from state-sponsored hacking groups. The FBI brought in linguists and cyber intelligence analysts, and together they started connecting dots that had previously been overlooked. Daniel had been communicating with someone known only as Core, a name that appeared repeatedly in internal code comments and message headers. Tracking Core became the next mission, but Core didn't make it easy. The FBI's tracking efforts were constantly rerouted through VPNs in countries with no extradition treaties. Servers were wiped remotely before they could be seized, and when they finally got close, locating a device Daniel had used to contact Core's sophisticated kill switch activated, frying the hard drive and destroying any trace of its contents. Someone had money. Someone had power. And someone knew exactly how close they were getting. The tension around Thomas grew. Was he safe? Was anyone involved safe? For Thomas, the realization hit hard. He wasn't just trying to prove his innocence anymore. He was helping to stop something far bigger than he ever imagined. As federal teams expanded the investigation, Thomas faced another unexpected twist. A forensic scan of his own home network, initiated out of precaution, revealed a listening device hidden behind an old wall socket in his office. It wasn't the kind of gadget you'd buy online, it was military grade. This changed everything. If someone had been surveilling him directly, it meant the digital attacks were only part of the threat. The FBI quickly swept the rest of his home and confirmed multiple points of intrusion, one in his router, another in an old printer, and one shockingly embedded in a smart thermostat. Whoever wanted to control Thomas's identity wasn't just working online. They were physically close, and they had been for a while. With this discovery, the FBI reclassified the threat as an active domestic surveillance operation. A full protection detail was assigned to Thomas, and counterintelligence specialists were brought in. The case now crossed into multiple agencies in SA, DHS, and even military cyber units. As pressure mounted, Thomas became both a symbol of the vulnerability of personal data and a resource for decoding the strategies of cyber infiltrators. He was invited to briefing sessions, closed-door task force meetings, and high-level intel briefings. For someone who had once lived a quiet, almost anonymous life, Thomas was now at the center of something monumental. And while the outside world remained unaware of what was unfolding behind classified walls, inside those rooms, Thomas began to feel a sense of clarity. His life had been shattered, but in that destruction, he had uncovered a skill and a purpose he never knew he had. He wasn't just helping catch a criminal anymore. He was becoming a silent operative in a war most people didn't even know was being fought. But the question still haunted him every night. Who was Corrend? How deep did this go? It wasn't long before a break came from an unexpected angle. A former intelligence contractor who had been under quiet observation for unrelated cyber activities contacted the FBI through an encrypted channel. He claimed to know who Core was. Not a name, not a face, but a pattern, a set of digital fingerprints, a behavior profile. According to this source, Core wasn't a single person, but a code name used by a network of elite hackers for hire operating out of Eastern Europe. It's possibly backed by state actors. The contractor provided evidence: fragments of old IRC logs, snippets of Python scripts with identical obfuscation techniques used in Daniel's attack files, and metadata from server dumps that had only ever been seen in a handful of deeply classified international cyber incidents. For the FBI and Thomas, this was both a breakthrough and a new burden. It meant they weren't just dealing with Daniel anymore. Daniel was the tip of a very large, very dangerous iceberg. He had been recruited, groomed, perhaps by a collective that specialized in identifying talented but disillusioned coders, giving them tools, resources, and anonymity in exchange for their cooperation. Somewhere along the line, Daniel had taken the bait. He'd agreed to compromise his own colleague's identity for the promise of influence and wealth. That betrayal still cut deep for Thomas. But now, there was no time to dwell. The operation needed to move fast. The FBI launched coordinated efforts with international cybercrime units. Diplomatic channels were opened under tight confidentiality. Thomas, meanwhile, was asked to do something extraordinary: to go back online. As himself, but carefully staged to look like he was going rogue. It was bait, a trap meant to attract Core's attention. The risk was immense. If the hacker network suspected the setup, they could vanish in minutes. But if it worked, they might reveal themselves to only a glimpse. So Thomas agreed. Under supervision, he reactivated old accounts, planted subtle messages in deep web communities, and posted code snippets that mirrored Daniel's past attacks. And then they waited. For days, there was silence. Then a message. A private, encrypted ping that simply read, "Nice to see you back." It came through an onion-rooted connection with no discernible origin. But the phrasing, the style, it matched the communications previously tied to Core. The trap had worked. The FBI mobilized in real time, monitoring every byte that passed through Thomas's device. Over the next several hours, more messages followed, subtle, cryptic, but increasingly bold. Whoever was on the other end believed they were speaking to a newly awakened version of Thomas, a skilled hacker, finally stepping out of the shadows. It was clear they wanted something: access, cooperation, or possibly more information that only Thomas could provide. And while the FBI kept the responses carefully controlled, they let the conversation flow, hoping to draw Core further in. The operation escalated into a psychological chess match. Thomas was briefed before each reply he sent, trained on how to sound like someone who had been betrayed and was now seeking power through rebellion. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was pretending to become the very thing he'd fought so hard to prove he wasn't. But it worked. The more he leaned into this persona, the more the enemy opened up. Eventually, Coro, one of them, shared an invitation: access credentials to a secure dark web forum known only to high-level operatives. The FBI acted immediately. Using a ghosted device, they entered the forum, captured its structure, its user hierarchy, and most importantly, the server routing. It was the first concrete lead to the network's infrastructure they'd ever had. And then, just like that, the forum disappeared. Within minutes of the FBI's entrance, every post was deleted, every connection severed. But it was too late. The trace had already been made. The IP chain pointed to a server cluster hosted in a remote part of Moldova, registered through layers of shell companies. It was a door cracked open for a moment, but open enough. The FBI now had targets, real-world locations, names, potential arrests. And none of it would have happened without Thomas's courage, patience, and sharp mind. He had gone from suspect to key asset in one of the most sophisticated cyber investigations in U.S. history. But the war wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. As the investigation shifted to Moldova, the FBI coordinated with Europol and local cyber units to plan a series of higher-risk raids. Intelligence gathered from the now-defunct forum led them to believe that the servers were more than just digital tools. They were physical hubs operated by members of Core's network. Thomas, though no longer on the front lines, remained crucial. His insight helped analysts identify coding signatures that tied Daniel's work directly to server-side operations. It wasn't just metadata anymore. It was hard evidence. Satellite surveillance, combined with wiretaps and old financial transfers, painted a clearer picture. The facility wasn't hidden in the shadows, it was hiding in plain sight as a data analysis firm for global logistics companies. Simultaneously, Thomas struggled with what his life had become. He was still living under federal protection, unable to return to work, his reputation still publicly stained. The FBI had cleared his name internally, but the story never made it to the press. To the world, he was still that guy who got arrested. In a cybercrime case, every day was a reminder that justice behind closed doors didn't always mean redemption in the open. And yet, he stayed with the case. Not for revenge, not even for closure, but because he felt responsible. He had helped the enemy get that close. Helping stop them now felt like the only way forward. When the raids finally came, they were swift and calculated. Armed teams stormed 3 properties simultaneously across Chisinau. They found server farms, encrypted hard drives, and most importantly, evidence of real-world coordination between Daniel Harper and operatives codenamed Vector, Mantis, and Core. One man was arrested while trying to destroy a RAID array. Another fled through underground access tunnels but was caught before reaching the border. But the real prize came when they captured Core's primary system, a custom-built, air-gapped terminal with a proprietary OS designed to self-destruct if tampered with. Miraculously, a digital forensics team managed to clone its contents before the failsafe was triggered. What they found would ripple through intelligence circles for years. Inside Core's system were archives of conversations, payments, and plans spanning nearly a decade. There were files on targets in over 25 countries, lists of assets, and stunningly detailed profiles on hundreds of cybersecurity professionals, including Thomas. He was not just collateral, he had been a long-term mark. From as early as 2017, there were mentions of his growing influence in cybersecurity forums, records of conferences he'd attended, and even transcripts of podcasts where he'd discussed encryption ethics. Core's network had identified him as a useful pawn years before anything happened. That knowledge hit Thomas like a truck. It wasn't random, it was orchestrated. More than just technical files, the system revealed strategy. Memos, documents that outlined how to exploit disillusionment in the tech world, how to recruit isolated experts, and how to dismantle trust networks inside companies. Core's collective hadn't just been hacking computers. They'd been hacking people. The FBI called in behavioral analysts to decode the psychological techniques embedded in recruitment emails and fake job offers. It was clear that Daniel hadn't been corrupted in a moment of weakness. He'd been targeted, studied, and slowly turned over years. The digital breadcrumbs Thomas had followed now told a much deeper, more disturbing story. The public still knew none of this. The arrests in Moldova made brief headlines in European media, reported simply as a cybercrime syndicate bust. There were no names, no mention of Thomas, and certainly no clues about the scale of what had truly been uncovered. The FBI urged discretion. The risk of retaliation was high. Core might have lost a major node, but their network wasn't entirely gone. Meanwhile, Thomas was offered a role quietly as an advisor to a new interagency task force. At first, he hesitated. He was tired, mentally exhausted. But then he remembered the feeling of being powerless, of sitting across from agents who saw him as the villain. He took the offer. This time, he wouldn't just help clear his name. He'd help make sure no one else ever went through what he did. Thomas's new role took him deep into the intelligence community's backrooms briefings in windowless rooms. Encrypted drives passed hand to hand, protocols he had never even imagined during his civilian life. He wasn't a spy, and he didn't want to be, but he was a mind they needed, someone who understood both the language of code and the psychology of betrayal. Over the next few months, he helped the task force model how Core's network operated like a decentralized organism, each part aware of the others, but independently functional. That meant they couldn't just arrest leaders, they had to dismantle the system's architecture, the code, the money channels, the recruitment methods. One of his most critical insights came while analyzing communication timestamps across time zones. Thomas noticed that activity spiked not during Eastern European hours, but during U.S. Pacific business hours. That anomaly led the team to uncover that part of Core's network. Possibly, even its central planning arm was operating from within the United States. And if that were true, then this wasn't just a foreign threat, it was domestic. The FBI's scope expanded again. With new warrants in hand, they traced money flow through shell LLCs in Delaware and found ties to tech consultancies operating out of San Francisco. Behind one such consultancy, they found an operative codenamed Pale Fire, a strategist, who had helped recruit Daniel Harper. Undercover recordings revealed this operative speaking about using burnout as leverage and weaponizing the disillusionment of white hat hackers. It was a dark mirror of everything Thomas believed. In the message was clear: the greatest threat to digital infrastructure wasn't just brute force attacks, It was ideological warfare. And the battlefield was the minds of people like Thomas. People who were skilled, overlooked, frustrated, and dangerously capable. In a final stunning development, Thomas was brought into a debriefing involving recovered files from Pale Fire's device. Among them was a dossier labeled Project Lantern. It was a list names, photos, behavioral profiles of cybersecurity professionals across the world. Some were already compromised. Others were marked for future manipulation. And Thomas's name was near the top. Not only that, chit showed how Daniel had submitted monthly reports on him, tracking his moods, his frustrations at work, even his disagreements with company leadership. Daniel had acted not only as a hacker, but as a watcher monitoring Thomas in real life and reporting back to a psychological warfare team. Thomas stared at the screen in disbelief. This had never been about the code. This had always been about control. And now, with the full weight of the evidence before them, the task force initiated a covert project of their own to dismantle what remained of Project Lantern from the inside. They created new identities for those at highest risk. Some were relocated. Others were brought in, like Thomas, to join the fight. Slowly, one by one, the task force began unraveling the invisible strings that had quietly been pulling at corners of the cybersecurity world. For Thomas, it was redemption, but also a new kind of burden. He couldn't unsee what he'd seen. He couldn't unknow what he now knew. Every piece of tech, every online interaction, every whispered conversation had taken on a new weight. But strangely, he didn't feel afraid. He felt focused. If they had chosen him as a target because of his mind, then now he would use that same mind to bring them down. No longer a pawn, no longer a suspect, but a quiet force standing between the world and the next digital collapse. Months later, after dozens of coordinated operations, indictments, and silent takedowns, the network that once hid behind the name Core was functionally dismantled. Some members disappeared, some were arrested, and some flipped providing testimony in closed-door sessions that may never see the light of public record. Project Lantern was exposed, and protocols were rewritten across intelligence agencies to safeguard professionals from being manipulated by bad actors hiding in plain sight. It had taken years of preparation, but only one mistake could dress Thomas Raines for the operation to begin to unravel. Thomas eventually returned to a quieter life. The FBI offered him a formal commendation, though it was delivered in private without ceremony. His name was never cleared in the press. But those who mattered knew. And more importantly, he knew. He published a book under a pseudonym detailing the ethics of digital trust and psychological targeting in cybersecurity. It became required reading in intelligence training programs. Quietly, without recognition or revenge, he changed the landscape of digital defense. One day, while sipping coffee at a small coastal cafe, Thomas received a secure message. It was from a burner device he hadn't used in months. The message was only one line: still watching. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. He smiled not out of fear, but understanding. The game never ends. But this time, he was ready? Not as a victim, not as a target, but as someone who had seen the edge and decided to walk it anyway. And so, the story of Thomas Raines doesn't end with a headline or a courtroom victory. It ends in quiet resistance and continued vigilance. Because in the shadows, where the digital world meets the human mind, the most powerful weapon is not code, but clarity. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, imagine how many more like it are still hidden in the shadows. Don't forget to hit that like button if you want more real-life digital thrillers. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, and share this video with someone who thinks cybersecurity is just about firewalls and passwords. Because, as you've just seen, sometimes the truth is more dangerous than fiction.